So when I first started talking to my friend about soteriology 101, just like some things I've heard about, like like not like Calvinism, like the responses to Calvinism. I brought it up to a friend who's very familiar with this program, and I remember we were at a coffee shop in Utah, and we were just talking about this, and he like just totally dismissed it. He was like, "Well, Leighton Flowers, like all he argues against is like hyper Calvinism, and like that's totally different than Calvinism." And I was very confused on what's the difference between hyper Calvinism and just consistent like Calvinism is. So I guess that kind of goes along with my first question.
That's a great question. One of the accusations I do get somewhat regularly from what I call nominal Calvinists, or maybe quasi Calvinists. In other words, they are not Calvinists that represent what John Calvin and leading Calvinistic scholars actually teach from the confessional form of Calvinism, as you would see in the Westminster or the London Baptist Confession of Faith. Those who hold to and know what they're talking about, Calvinism, and in other words, the scholars who know what they're talking about, they affirm what is called theistic determinism. In other words, God determines whatsoever comes to pass. All things have been decreed by God. And that form of determinism seems overly fatalistic to a lot of people at first hearing, as you can imagine. Well, that's true of even some Calvinists, because sometimes Calvinists have just kind of put up blinders, and they haven't really read the sources. They haven't studied the actual scholars from their worldview, and they think Calvinism is only soteriological with regard to God's determining certain people to believe the gospel so as to be saved, and it's all about God determining who will be saved and who won't. When in reality, biblical Calvinism that's based upon what John Calvin and Piper and MacArthur, the leading Calvinists, actually teach, they actually affirm everything is in accordance with the divine decree, not just someone's salvation. And so the concept of theistic determinism, that's not hyper Calvinism. That's just basic plain old Calvinism as it's rightly defined. It's just that so many of the new Calvinists today have not studied the original scholars, and they're not very well educated. I'm not trying to be mean to your friend whatsoever. I mean, I was the same way, and when I was in my early 20s and my teenage years, I didn't know these things, and so I might have came to an understanding of Calvinism as just being about God somehow, deciding who will be saved, and it doesn't have anything to do with determinism. But we've had leading Calvinistic scholars on the program. We've engaged with them, like from the French philosopher Bignon, who is a highly esteemed Christian Calvinist, who very clearly promotes and defends theistic determinism, that God determines whatsoever comes to pass. And so if they don't understand that that's Calvinism, just plain Calvinism, then they don't understand Calvinism. And I'm accused of not understanding it because they don't. So I'm quoting from the actual sources. I'm bringing the scholarly materials. Very oftentimes, the new Calvinist, the quasi-Calvinist, don't even know what the original sources say. They haven't looked at the scholars, the best scholars of their worldview, and so they're just misled. But when we come to the label hyper-Calvinism, labels are subjective, meaning that anyone can define them however it suits their fancy. And so hyper-Calvinism is typically most generally known as to be anti-evangelistic. And I've been very clear to explain that I believe men like John Piper, who is a theistic determinist, he is a Calvinist and a theistic determinist, but he is pro-evangelism. He is not anti-evangelism. And so he's not considered a hyper-Calvinist by that definition. Now, there's men like Phil Johnson from Grace to You Ministries, who also defines as elements of hyper-Calvinism things like denying the well-meant offer of the gospel. In other words, that there's not really an offer, there's not really an appeal of God, because then he would be failing. If people were to reject his appeal and his offer, then God would be failing somehow. And that is actually a form of hyper-Calvinism that some scholars have accused James White and some other higher Calvinists of falling into, because they seem to downplay the well-meant offer or the appeal of God to all people through the gospel. And so there's a line there that can be drawn depending on who you are and where you are on the spectrum of those things, just like with the whole Pelagian controversy, semi-Pelagianism. It's all subjective based upon the person you're talking to and how they would like to define the term in order to possibly boogeyman their opponent. And sometimes people from our side, the provisionist side and the Arminian side, will label somebody a hyper-Calvinist to boogeyman them, to make them sound as bad as possible, when the truth of the matter is they may actually be a mainstream Calvinist as much as John Calvin was, at least. So hopefully that answers the question.